welcome to Von Blog. And I'm here with poet Bianca Stone, author of collections such as What Is Otherwise Infinite, which I have around here, The Mobius Stiff of Grief, Someone Else's Wedding Vows. Also, sort of, I believe the first time I actually heard of you, and I didn't even realize it was the same person that Daniel Tutt was interviewing a couple months back, was your work with Anne Carson as a visual artist. And you also have an interest in psychoanalysis, which is, I believe, why Daniel had you on. I am always interested in getting poets to talk about political poetry because, to be blunt, I think most political poetry is overly didactic and bad. But and it may be also because now that I've been out of the MFA world in any capacity for like a decade, and I deal a lot more with poetry festivals that are mixtures of that world and like street poetry and slam poetry. And I actually like slam poetry, but most of the political sentiments in there are both didactic but also very thin. Like, as politics, I'm often like, I don't know what I would even do with this politically. It's like a political moral sentiment more than it is a political statement. And I was thinking about that, and I was contrasting that in my head while I was thinking about interviewing you, and we were going back and forth on what we would talk about, with Plato's utter hostility to poetry, as you know, the myth is the creation of a political delusion for him. Now, some of that may be the age-old "I'm a former poet and I want revenge" resentment that we have with Plato, if some of that's to be believed.
Yeah.
But I also have always found it funny, and it may just because of what we have from Plato that survives. His dialogues are awfully poetic, and also like ridiculously didactic. Like, I remember as a young philosophy student, that was my other gig, philosophy and anthropology on one side and poetry on the other. Reading Plato, I mean, like, this is really majestic, except that your interlocutors are so fake, I can't even think straight. Like, who would be this dumb to walk into your trap? This question is obviously a trap.
You mean he already had? He was pushing you towards something already, and you could see it coming.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Like the dialogues are so didactic that you're just like, by engaging in the question the way it's been framed to you, you're already doomed. And I remember thinking about that not just as an annoying trait of dialogues and dialectics in classical and early medieval philosophy, but also as like a bad poetic. It's a poetic that really, really thinks it already knows where it's going. And when Plato's most interesting is when he allows Socrates to actually not succeed in his obvious question leading, like when Socrates runs smack dab into Parmenides or something like that. It's just textually those are more interesting. So as a person who works in poetry, and I guess I was reading a lot of your work, and I was like, would I categorize your work as political or not? And I realized with your work that I couldn't answer that question.
Good.
And yeah, which I think is probably a good place to be. So, so I wanted to ask you, like, as a person very familiar with the classics, how do you respond?
I wouldn't say that, but yeah.
Well,
somewhat familiar, and of course, like, growing more and more familiar as they touch everything I'm reading across different genres. And as a poet, As a poet looking into poet theory and history of poetry, it's so important. But go on with your question.
Well, yeah, this is like a very front-loaded question. The question that I had is, what do you make of the philosophical ambivalence? Let's just say, let's put it that way, to poetry, particularly poetry that is not didactic. That somehow, for a lot of political thinkers and philosophical thinkers, that scares them. Why do you think that seems to be the case? And do you think that I'm even being fair on that?
Non-didactic poetry?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, let's back up a little bit. In terms of poetry posing a question that already has an answer, or that is leading you towards an answer, or that is trying to make an argument in a certain direction, already you've left the realm of poetry, I think. So I think of this idea of, it's kind of an idea that Elizabeth Sewell talks about in The Orphic Voice, which is that the incredible thing about, and she's talking about the myth of Orpheus and poetry, but poetry as formulating the question. Let's see. Right. So the method in poetry is to formulate a question that doesn't have one answer, and that has multiple answers, and that's what poetry is, right? I mean, it's a mode of interpretation and analyzing. It can hold several truths. How can you present a poem that has only one truth that it wants you to have? It's almost like, it feels more like propaganda at that point, or something. Like, the poem wants you to think with it, right? If the poem wants you to think with it and to grasp a kind of truth within it that isn't even present yet, it's something else when it has the truth already laid out beforehand. And I think that's why one would keep coming back to a poem, right? Like, why do we keep coming back to myth? Like, why does one keep going back to the myth of Orpheus or the myth of Oedipus? In terms of classicism, it's still being relevant, is I think that they do hold truths, but they don't come out presenting, this is what it means. So, like, let's think about how that leads to the second part of your question, which is, why is anybody wary of a poem where they don't understand the meaning right away? It's like an uncomfortable place to be, to say, I don't know what this poem means, and I don't know where it's pointing me towards, and I don't know what its stance is necessarily. I think that for somebody who wants to lay out truths about how thought works, it can be kind of terrifying to have that unknown part of thought exist in the poem, that can't be grasped. But why have that anyway? I don't know. I think that's a good question, is like, why have a poem that is open to interpretation? Like, what does that do? It seems like for a philosopher, it would kind of be like fertile ground.
You would think so, but it is fascinating, the number of people I know who are into philosophy and who can't deal with poetry, like, at all. There's a friend of mine Colin Brum, who's just always ranting on on X or slash Twitter about, you know, poets giving up their propaganda power, and I was just like,
Poets
you know,
giving up their
the
propaganda
propaganda
power?
power, yeah,
Is
because
You mean poetry gives up its propaganda power?
yeah, and he thinks that's useless, and I'm just like, well, that's an interesting one. It's an interesting idea of use, um, what the use of that is for, and two, um, I suspect what he's referring to is like the fact that particularly early poetics, because it is tied into sound in a way that relates to memory. As anyone's ever got a poem stuck in their head, or song lyrics or anything can kind of tell you that would have a lot of didactic power. But I'm like,
How would that have didactic power, though?
I'm not sure. It's
Song.
not like a song has ever changed my politics. Like,
Yeah. I mean, I think change is interesting because what is something that could pose the possibility of change and to change somebody's heart? Um, when I think didactic, I think somebody wants you to change in a certain way
mm-hmm,
that they want, right? And there's it this is a distinction as I mean, there's lots of different kinds of poetry, right? But I think in a way, and there's like poetry historically situated in response to certain things that are happening historically. Then there's a sort of like core like event of poetry that feels linked to something very ancient and somehow aligned with language and groups of people communicating, right? But also, like, it's not just that, it's like our relation to the world and like being actually in the material world among nature, wondering why we're here and all these things, right? So, yes, I think a poem, you could think of a poem as something like you could lull somebody into with your beautiful song into listening to what you're saying. But
mm-hmm.
does that really happen? Like, are you talking people into things with your beauty, you know? Um, beautiful song? Or are you almost like creating, it almost is like something else is happening. When I feel like I'm lulled into the musicality of a poem, I'm at once actually listening to language and not listening to language. Like, there's
Mm-hmm.
some sort of element of participating in a poem where I feel like in that moment, there's like an immediate presence of being in the world, being seen by another person in their language and consciousness. But then there's this other sort of ineffable event happening with the music where I feel, and we can even say this was what happens when we're swept up with music that, doesn't have any words or something like an orchestra or something. That we're having an experience, we're having a lot of sensations at work, and there is a sense of like, um it's not just enjoyment, but like, because sometimes it can be very upsetting even, right? Like, what's
Mm-hmm.
happening to me? Something's happening to me. Like, something is being like loosened up or like evoked in the psyche, and like one feels a little bit like they're becoming more into the world. Um, so I worry about things like trying to talk someone into something that's already set in stone, which would presume that we know, even as the writer, what we want. Because I think a lot of the writing of poetry too, on the poet's part, is an act of sort of like I don't, when I say self-discovery, I mean like more like a construction of the self begins to become in the poem that is paradoxically too outside of the self and has nothing to do with Bianca, right? But as a writer, I am in the process of an almost like, I would say, like a philosophical like investigation into what it means to be a thinking person in the world and to interact with different parts of my psyche in the poem itself and to invite the reader to participate in that. And in that, we sort of construct the poem together. So how could I go into the poem knowing what I want to say to the reader and what that means? And it's like a very subtle difference, because the thing too, I think that could be persuasive in poetry is that it invokes passion and feeling. And if you're a person who's experienced hardship or marginalization, or you've lacked voice or something like that, and the poem evokes a heartbreaking experience that you've experienced, and it can show somebody else on a emotional level like what it's like to be you. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's, but I wonder how effective that is in terms of like swaying people politically. I don't know. It may, I don't know.
Well, it leads me to one of the concepts on Plato that I actually think is useful for poets to sit with. And one of the things that maybe contradicts what I was characterizing the Platonic dialogues as doing is that they end in aporia, which is this inability to, for doing this for my audience, but this is an inability to fully deal with a paradox or an impasse, or some kind of like seemingly opaque realization, where the realization is not so much a positive realization, but the realization is a potential realization, which I know that distinction is probably difficult for people, but like the sense that there is a productive confusion at the end because the signs that you are having to deal with have reached some kind of limit. Like their semiotic clarity start to fall apart, and the better Platonic dialogues really do this, where you're just like, I don't know what that word means now. I don't know. I can feel it. I can tell that there's something here, right? But I often I can't analytically go forward with it in a place where I can just like, oh, I can like define this term in the analytic sense of philosophy and move on, because I have now problematized that idea to a way that I have to kind of feel my way around it, not just reason my way around it. Although, as we both know, that binary is a little bit fake. But that the way we're taught to deal with signs. And when I deal with a lot of students, and even I often have people tell me like, well, how do you understand poetry? And sometimes my answers to them is just, you don't. Like, that's part of the point. And not in like not in this obnoxious, mystifying like, oh, it's just there to confuse you way, but in like, a lot of these poems are trying to get you to look at something that it is almost impossible to say in words, or that the word, when you look at the words hard enough, they start getting so fuzzy that like you have to feel them, not define them. And that's a big ask for a lot of people who want most communication to be somewhat linear. Although I say that, and I think about like even like the metatextuality of memes and stuff on the internet, that like they also kind of work similarly. If you like, a lot of them are not actually cognitively, there's so many references in them that they're not actually cognitively clear.
Yeah.
So,
well, it is interesting with with poetry, our way of understanding how that language is a kind of like transaction in which one can like Badiou was talking about with the matheme, and the sort of like following the was it Dionea or right, so being able to traverse between ideas and thoughts and make deductions from that, and that poetry dissolves that there are certain points in the poem, always, if a poem is successful, in my opinion, and I think this goes across the board in terms of what poetry is that like you can't link together and deduct a clear answer out of it. Now, it's interesting because doesn't that reflect in a way being? Because isn't there so much about, I mean, even when we talk about the unconscious, that is unknowable, untranslatable, beyond language. At the same time, we use language and poetry specifically to intimate these things. I would say, like, poetry always comes up in these moments, and for Plato it was too, right? He had to revert to the images of the sun and images from different myths in order to grasp and elucidate and enlarge on those moments where language was failing or something, right? So, right, in a sense, I always think of too, like, allowing for the mystery and the unknowability of experience in the poem allows for us to keep knowing, right? So it's in the service of continued knowing, and in this sort of like unfolding of knowledge and truth as we go on. So it, you know, and this stretches across time. If we can still go back to poems written hundreds of years ago that pose the question but don't give the answer, or have multiple answers or two truths, then we have this sort of like question posed across time that keeps giving. And I think this is interesting in terms of talking about translation too, because when one is like having so many issues translating Rilke over the years, or Ovid, or whatever it is, like, we continue in the context of our history, in the context of our psychical movements as species, in context with the political, let's say, too. Language changes, language evolves, language has its own sense of consciousness. It's not some stagnant thing in the past, right? And it would have to, right? I clearly, some part of that is about the unknowability or the untranslatability of, I'm afraid to say ideas, but like, sort of truths, I guess I would say, in the poem. But it is so fucking interesting because, I have a couple friends who are like you, like they deep read stuff, that they're like deep in the philosophy and, or in the psychoanalytic discourse. That's like, when I creep on it on Twitter X, I'm like, I don't understand what they're talking about most of the time. And I find it like kind of fascinating and fun to like watch. Right. But it's so, let's say, like, incredibly like deep into theory, and seems very complicated and hard to understand. And then I'll send them a poem and like, I don't understand this poem. And I'm like, this is amazing that, like, you're so smart in this one way, but like you can't surrender to this, because it's also not like the poem's nonsense, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I've become so good at analyzing poems and analyzing for meaning in poems that, like, when I read a poem, it's not like I'm just, sometimes I'll read a Ashbery poem and I'm not analyzing it for like the overall meaning of it, right? It works differently than that. But, but I can still glean meaning from it everywhere, and it's conscious and unconscious on the poet's part, right? And then there's these moments where it feels untranslatable, like and it also would be like terrible and would ruin the poem if I could translate it. And but yet one experiences it anyway, right? So I think to that, like, it's kind of like a surrender to not knowing and like not having to explain what freedom that is. Like, wouldn't it be great if we could just, this is where psychoanalysis comes in too, is like, oh, what happens when we like free associate or listen to madness or listen to nonsense, and like what yes, there's a lot of like madness, right? That means nothing in there, but always there is meaning at some point that that creates change in the moment between people, and one furthers themselves psychically, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this use of Plato and Badiou, and I was, this part of this conversation is reminding me of something he says in there about syntax specifically. That, like, poets have to be. I'm paraphrasing here, but poets have to use syntax, but syntax itself is unpoetic. That, like, because because what syntax is like, a boundary gate of a kind of logic, right? Like, we're inscribing the logic down, with these, punctuation and word order depending on the language, and particles depending on the language, and yet
Mm,
there's a way in which even poetry that doesn't seem like it's obvious, that isn't ancient poetry, that doesn't immediately seem, quote, weird the way that people assume modern poetry does,
yeah.
still is in tension with that. Like, and I also think about, this thing about translatability, like, um trying to get, when a poem breaks syntax for a reason in ancient poetry, like, I think there's some of this in Homer, and you're just like dealing with what the meaning of that break is, even in the break in the logic, like,
Yeah.
and that makes a lot of linear thinkers really uncomfortable. you know
The break in the syntax, and they're like, "What
right,
the hell does this mean?"
right, yeah, and
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's hard. Yeah, go on.
no, go ahead.
Well, I think as a poet, you become more and more obsessed with syntax and the construction of the line itself, which is a very subtly complex, um, form of way of approaching writing, right? So we have different rules and laws about how grammar and syntax and structure works in our writing in terms of how it's taught in contemporary Western culture. But the poem upends that, of course. The problem I have with a lot of my students is they're sort of like doing it randomly. They don't have any, they're
Right.
experimenting, which is great, but at the same time, like, unfortunately, for, like, one thing I could say for the Greeks too is, like, they were so poetry was such an integral part of their culture that everybody studied it from the beginning, and it was, like, interwoven in their lives completely as a way to, like, understand their lives and their beliefs, right? And their spirituality and everything. So, um, people studied the way that poetry was written by people in the past who had written poetry, and the structures of language and how to do it, right? So we can think about form when people talk about nobody really writes in form anymore, right? We're not writing when people write sonnets, they're not an iambic pentameter. They may be like 17 lines, not an iambic pentameter, but we're just calling it a sonnet,
Mhm.
nobody's writing villanelles, right? Nobody's even scanning, right? So it's more intuitive nowadays. But the Greeks knew that study of the form was very important, but they also knew that breaking it and creating newness out of it was important. And a lot of that came from um, an appreciation of the unseen forces at work within the self and like the gods moving through us or something like that, right? So like one becomes sort of like uh um a mouthpiece for something beyond the self. And in these ways, like, it is really dangerous to have an individual speaking truths through their poetry as if the gods were speaking through one, right? So it would be like an important role to have. Anyway, I say all this to come back to the idea of syntax now, which is that syntax, we don't study the importance of I guess the history of the construction of the line, but then also our important decisions on where to break that. But we do focus on things like, okay, I'm going to break the line here for a certain reason.
Mhm.
Maybe I half know it, maybe I don't. Sometimes we can sort of see that it creates double meaning and things like that. It creates expectations to the reader. Oh, it means this. And then we get to the other line. We see it doesn't mean that. It means something else. So we're kind of fucking with the reader a little bit. It's when I was reading too about the idea of logic being important for the philosophical structure, obviously. And it is very important for the poetic line too. Syntactically, we create our own logic within the line. And so when I'm working with students too on their poems, and like the line is too obfuscating and it's not speaking to me as a reader, it's because they're not creating a kind of logic within the images and metaphors that they're exploring. And I think we're a little afraid of the power that comes with creating our own logic and syntax. But that's how the poet is a maker, and poesis is a kind of like power to create out of nothing, seemingly nothing.
Yeah.
Something
Seemingly
out of
nothing,
something.
anyway.
I think nothing is supposed to come from nothing, but it's like creating something out of seemingly nothing.
Yeah, it's. I mean, when you think about the way people would approach didactic poetry, we've talked about all this stuff and syntax and all that. One of the issues that I think this leads to is like, um, is that the didactic poem, uh, if it works as didactics, it's not going to go into the kind of liminal spaces of creation that poems probably should. I'm very hesitant to say always should, but probably should. It seems
Well,
like it honestly it seems like a weird use of the form. Like you're using a form of communication that's ill suited for this in some ways. You know,
I think
just silly.
poetry, yeah, you have to understand in a way when we're approaching poetry that it's a relational event between two people, not present to each other. In that way, the reader is a co-creator in the poem. It's just to reiterate again, like if you're telling somebody how shit, sorry, I keep swearing. If you're telling somebody how things work and what they should understand and do, you're not giving them any chance to create the poem with you. Um, and this is the secret of poetry, is that it's not about understanding it. It's about participating in an experience with it.
Right.
And seeing what you can know from it. And it's like there's a place for didactic education, but I wonder if one is, maybe it is closer to what my understanding of sophistry is like using the poetic methods in order to convince somebody of something, which is a kind of, in a way, like this idea of the lie um in poetry, which of course Plato was, this was important to him, that like poets lie and we can't have lying for the masses because most of the masses don't understand. On one hand, he was like, most people aren't smart enough to discern what the lie is actually doing. They only understand the surface level of the lie. It makes me think of the way people interpret the Bible, right? They don't understand the deeper truths within. I think of the Bible similarly as I think to myth, which is that like language and narrative and it is used in order to like encode in word hidden esoteric truths that cannot be looked at directly, that in a way it is a lie, right? Because you're telling this story that didn't happen exactly that way, and you're making things up, right? You're putting on a personas and all these different things in poetry. Why? Right? This is another issue with the political, right? Does the political can a political poem hold room for a persona? Can it hold room for, like, I was reading Elliot Weinberger's essay on poetry of witness, right? Like, what does it mean to write a poem like having been a witness to something? And then why does that give you the authority to be why does that make it political, that you have this like journalistic eye on things, but doesn't what does it mean to hold witness to something when you're in a mask, when you're talking about unknowability and paradox and ambivalences and two truths and the unconscious? Like, how does that work, right? So and who are the people deciding what makes somebody able to talk about one thing and not another? So all these issues come up with, I think, hairy issues come up in talking about the political poem, which is, you could even say that the act of writing a poem in general is a political act, because it's a radical act of an individual speaking in their voice and presenting their own relationship with the world against and at odds with what might be acceptable morally for, I don't know. So, but when we think about what makes something political, we would say that it has to deal with a group of people, or it has to embody an element of what a group of people want or don't want, right? When you think about the Russians back in the day, who all had to write political poetry or they were out, writing about your personal life was an act of defiance to the political poem.
Oh yeah, that's. I mean, we were talking off air about one of the ironies of the two great communist leaders, and I use that with all appropriate scare quotes. We were talking about Mao being a poet, but I was also like, Stalin was a poet. Stalin was actually a good poet, even. Which is, yeah, I know. Mao's poetry is like, but like Stalin's poetry is actually pretty good. And Marx's poetry, if you've ever, there are some Marx poems, and they are the most. Yeah, they're not good, and they're very gothy, to use a modern term. But Stalin's poetry is like strangely good. And I was thinking about this tension. We've been talking about, we've been referencing kind of obliquely from the vantage point of the Unknowable by Badiou. But I was also thinking about this tension that you see in Zizek. Not that I like Zizek's kind of like Bette Noor. I actually don't love Zizek, but one of the things about Zizek is he talks about basically that poets are almost always aestheticized in a way that makes them closer to authoritarians, and that maybe Plato was right. And I find this very funny, because I'm like, well, I can think of a lot of authoritarian leaders who were poets, absolutely nationalist. However, there are infinitely more who were not.
Yeah, and yeah. I mean, Freud said, Freud just noted that poetry was indigenous to the very mind. We're all poets, right? Some of us wield it as a profession and are more apt well, we become poets, right? But I don't know. I mean, you can't say that only one kind of person is a poet, right? I mean, poetry might be our way of dealing with um working through, I'm not surprised in a way that these, massive and controversial leaders dabbled in poetry at one time because they were probably working through a lot of complex thoughts that
Mhm.
had also an like wrestled with their inner private formative experiences as a person in the world. And it's like you're drawn to poetry in order to do that, which is a kind of necessity in order to get you have to get you kind of have to get through it. But well, let's see. Here's the problem.
Mm.
Here's the problem. Now, Jung talked about this, and everybody I think should read this book called The Undiscovered Self. It's very short. It's actually a long essay, but made into a book by Jung, The Undiscovered Self, which he wrote in reaction to World War II, which was emphasizing the importance of a fierce and honest and, of course, painful inner gaze at oneself. And in order to be able to live honestly and in a mass society, because if we don't do that introspective work, we start projecting that stuff onto everyone else and saying, the shadows out there over there and on that side. And everybody, for the political like wave of popularity or tone or whatever, it's the divisiveness of it. Everyone's going to be like, that's the shadow, not, and no one's going to be looking inward at any sort of culpability, and it's all just going to keep perpetuating itself. I believe, and this is, he's talking about psychoanalysis, of course, but I think poetry in a way engages with a similar fierce and individual introspective gaze. And I think that is an important element to the political, because we have to balance it out, right? We have to make decisions for the many in the political sphere in the city, but how can we live as a faceless mass? What will that do to our sense of individuality and experience? And we have to have some sort of like outlet for that. But the irony is that in psychoanalysis, you're in conversation with another person in a deeply intimate way that's also boundaried, obviously. But like even in an individual way, you're in relation. So it's in a way, it's like a microcosm of a cosmic relation to others. So it seems it's not isolated in the self alone. It's in relation to the other in that space. And then one sees themselves honestly in with the other. And then I don't know. In poetry is similar.
I think I can pull many themes from this, and maybe we can turn to a specific poem. But I want to pull the themes. Um, I think poetry is, in most cases, and I'm always hesitant to say all poetry do X, and I'm going to find a poem it doesn't that I like, because there
Of
are
course.
didactic poems that I like, but but I will say that that in a way, I think of Bakhtin, Emin Bakhtin, and the Soviet theory of really prose, actually, way more than poetry, and of speech resonances. But the reason why I think of it is that poetry makes this dialogic nature of how language works and how the self works. That, like, if you go to the self, you're not just talking to the meat being and the unconscious of the meat being that you are also dealing with the social being that has given you all the codes and all the utterances that give that any meaning. The encounter with other people is actually the only way that self has meaning at all. And I think the insight you made about psychoanalysis actually ties into this too. That, like, it's a conversation, and the way in which the self gets understood in psychoanalysis, the way you can even get to ordinary unhappiness, is actually, it's an intimate process, but it is a social process. At the same time. It's a relational process. So the poem is this interesting site where you have a relation to someone that you don't have a relation with. In the case of, like, poems in translation, for example, I mean, this is an interesting thing to think about. Like, I have a relation to what is probably a poetic tradition that we deem a dude, Homer. And I'm encountering that poem, which, once you kind of unlearn everything you learned about it in ninth grade, is a way fucking weirder poem than you think it is.
Totally.
Like the Iliad and the Odyssey are strange, even for Greek stuff. It's just like, okay, we got a narrative. Even in its construction, I'm like, okay, so half this is a flashback told to this other queen that we haven't even mentioned that it's in a frame story, and then, like, we kind of know that the speaker that we're talking to is a liar, and he's told us he's a liar over and over and over again. And, like, and also when he comes back home and he gets what he wants, he fucks everything up. And the language in this is also really weird if you actually start digging into the Attic Greek. So it's like, and so I encounter this, and there's, with a poem that old, and it was that central to culture. I mean, people forget. People used to read Homer like they read the fucking Bible.
Right.
There's, ostensibly almost 3,000 years of interpreted tradition and also in hundreds and hundreds of languages. Like, it's not just in, Greek and English here. And we're coming to that. And yet when I come to that, some of those fragments of the tradition of Homer that I've picked up somewhere just socially is there. And I can't undo that. That's already there in the consciousness. But also, I have to recreate this and make all these fragments make meaning every time I encounter that poem. And I pick the Odyssey or the Iliad. You can pick either one of them because they're so ubiquitous. The Bible's another one. All these biblical. I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating is when you start learning all the poetics in Hebrew and Koine Greek that are in the Bible, and you start learning, like, genre traditions that show up, and you're just like, I had no idea that this stuff had other meanings that the syntax is foreign to me. I've been told to read this like linear and straightforward, and it doesn't work. But there's also no way that I can undo these various interpretive traditions. Like, I'm not even a Christian, and yet Christian narratives necessarily come into my head when I hit trying to understand something in the Tanakh in the Old Testament, because I live in that culture as part of the dialogic world that I live in. And I think poetry, if you let yourself be okay with the fact that you have to deal with recreating this unnameable, to use a popular term today, almost a vibe that you have to interpret and create with the poet, a person who is, in most cases, since there's more poetry by dead people than alive people, because there's more dead people than alive people, you can't even access. And then if you can, like, if you ask me about a poem, I'm going to unintentionally lie about its meaning a lot of the time. I'm not even thinking, like, I'm not intentionally lying. I'm just like,
you mean your own poem or somebody else?
Yeah, my own poem. Particularly,
I mean, no poet wants to talk about what their poem means.
No,
doesn't it feel a little bit like like when if somebody does demand meaning, and you could be like, well, I can tell you what prompted this poem and what I thought I meant, and it so cheapens it. It's like the narrative, like autobiographical stuff that one mined in order to create this poem, like, is irrelevant a little bit. It's fun too. Like, we love talking about the context of poets' lives, and I think, especially with like Rilke or something, right? But in terms of our intention and our one should hope that the poem knows more than we do after we've written it. I don't want to know exactly what I meant. If I know everything that I was trying to do in the poem, like, I don't like the poem. Like, the poem sucks. I
Right.
wanna be surprised by my poem. I look at my poem, it's like that Greek idea, right? Who wrote this? Like, if I have this feeling of, like, surprise at any moment of my poem, and unfamiliarity, and I don't know exactly what this means, like, I feel really good about it. Like, it's a win. Yeah, like, I've achieved what I wanted and I can move on.
Yeah. I've sat through. I'm lucky to be known more as a political figure and a philosophical figure than a poetic figure in some ways. And the reason why I say I'm lucky is I no longer get asked as much to explain my poetry as I used to. But when I have done interviews recently where people are like, can you tell me what this means? And I'm just like, I could tell you, but I mean, frankly, I'd be bullshitting you.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like I don't
Yeah.
really remember or even know where all this is coming from.
Right.
And like, and also it I think you're right. It cheapens the poem as a social experience because you're coming to me as an authority, and the poem is more like, no, you have to make something out of this, and like you have to do that with all language actually, but it's really obvious with a poem. Like, um,
But you can see why there's anxiety in terms of the political, where it's like, one doesn't want the law, like, the interpretation of law is a huge issue, right? Who gets
oh
to
yeah,
interpret the law? Oh, the Supreme Court gets to interpret the law. Who gets to be on the Supreme Court is obviously like a huge choice because these people are interpreting it. Um, Whereas, right, there's no incontrovertible, like, set of principles, like, laid down in the poem. In fact, we
go
could,
ahead.
it was like, Rimbaud who said, that, poetry alchemizes the word, right? So,
Mm.
in the political, you wouldn't want to alchemize the beliefs of the group all of a sudden, like, uh, though at the same time, like,
We do it all the time though.
we
Like,
do, we do. It changes on its own. Like, right, the way that our constitution, for example, is interpreted by like a mass amount of people in this country is like, I don't know. I don't know if that's this not the same thing as alchemy, but it's certainly interpretation.
well, I mean, well, this uh, yeah, one of the interesting things. I studied English and philosophy and anthropology off of the idea that it would help me initially in law, and then I fell in love with the poetry part and thought, well, I was stupid.
You thought it would help
But
you in law?
yeah, with law, believe it or
Oh,
not,
it probably would.
yeah, well, it does. But you also start realizing that, like, for example, um, I think it's pretty well known amongst most lefties and liberals that originalism is bullshit, and I think it's even pretty well known now amongst most conservative.
Originalism, like what
Yeah,
people originally intended?
right. Well,
Right,
because you can't actually know.
right,
You can
right.
only like build a proxy representation, maybe sort of. And when it gets hard or when it gets politically inconvenient, I'll be frank with you, all those justices, I mean, some of them go further than others about how far they'll take that, but those justices all break at a certain point where they're just like, "Fuck it, no, we're just going to go with our current political biases,"
Right.
and
Well, also,
and
like, why does this one person, like, original intent, why is that set for eternity as, like, a moral purity? Like, is there some sort of like objective moral rightness that we can cling to because somebody wrote it in like 1700? It's just probably not. But I
No,
interrupted you. Go on.
no. I think that's actually a fair point.
So
I
if
mean,
you can't, so how can you write laws that make room for change and in an evolving society? Or rather, how can you make a society that is able to change with its laws or something? Like something has to be sort of.
well, I mean, in the U.S. experiment, and obviously there are huge problems with this, and I could go into the myriad of ways that the left winger I think is problematic. But one thing I will say is that even if you go back to the Constitution, the so-called bourgeois values it enshrines are both self-contradictory and difficult. And if you try to make them not so, it is almost always a dishonest move,
Mhm,
because, and even in the history of the country, like, um, it seems to me like we talk about originalism, and I'm always like, well, in some ways, the the document that you're being originalist about abrogates itself. So, for example, like the Civil War amendments, literally undo the fact that the Bill of Rights never applied to states, and states could have religious tests and racial tests or what the fuck ever until the Civil War, and they all did. No,
mhm,
well, not all. Like Virginia didn't, but most of them did. And even to the point, like before, but even with dealing with, like, quote, like the white men who were allowed to vote in the 19th century, trying to figure out who they were in what area and in what state is almost impossible to do. So, like, uh and that doesn't seem like a poetic problem, but it's actually related because all these things are interpreted, and if you try to freeze them, they become super fragile. Legal interpretive traditions, the ones that stand, and most of the ones that stand are religious, but, like, if none of them are interpreted sui generously on their own. If you approach, like the Islamic law, you have to interpret it through hadith, which is a tradition relationship. If you approach halakha, you have to interpret it through um, uh, rabbinical commentary, which is not in agreement with itself and is extremely social. I mean, Christians might deny it, but if you approach the Bible, you have to interpret it through an interpretive tradition to even make those laws make any sense, and most of them are abrogated. So it's just, when you look at law systems that survive, and we think of laws with governments, but I'm not even sure that we should always do that.
mhm,
You can see that the ones that survive are almost infinitely flexible. Like, I could go into scholarship about Islamic or Jewish or Christian law and be like, they have reinterpreted this like every probably generation and a half, uh, for thousands of years, and it
mhm,
changes. And the people who try to tell you that it isn't, who try to make it like this, to bring it back to Plato, this geometric form, uh, those people are usually A, dangerous, and B, lying. Like,
mhm, mhm.
so, and yeah, I think poetry makes that obvious. Like, if you just
Yeah.
you deal with, like, the fact that we're dealing in the same, I mean, from the human perspective, the kind of technology that we're dealing with, and put that in quotation marks, um, uh, that we're dealing with in law and that we're dealing with in poetry is remarkably similar, but they seem entirely different. And it's partly because the poem makes it obvious that you have to co-create this, and I also think that is, for a lot of people, that's a major anxiety, right? Like,
Right.
co-creation is like, oh no, I have responsibility for the meaning. Oh shit.
Mm. Yeah.
And there's probably a right answer because they're traumatized by some, like, ninth grade English teacher somewhere. Um, you know.
Well, we don't grow up getting that opportunity. Like, it gets squashed out of us to make meaning with language that we're presented with.
Mm. I wanted to turn this to a poem you sent me by Larry Levis, which is about Lorca, and I was thinking about the way, you mentioned going all the way back. You mentioned the way poets use masks or deflections,
Mhm.
and if you wouldn't mind reading the poem, and then maybe we can use that to kind of concretize and problematize everything we just said. So.
Yeah, let me grab it. Okay, so this is from Larry Levis's selected, and it's from the book The Dollmaker's Ghost. It's called Garcia Lorca, A Photograph of the Granada Cemetery, 1966. The men who killed poetry hated silence. Now they have plenty. In the ossuary at Granada, there are over 4,000 calm skulls whitening. The shrubs are in leaf behind the bones. And if anyone tries to count spines, he can feel his own scalp start to crawl back to its birthplace. Once I gave you a small stone I respected. When I turned it over in the dawn, after staying up all night, its pale depths resembled the tense face of Lorca spitting into an empty skull. Why did he do that? Someone should know. Someone should know by now that the stone was only an amulet to keep the dead away. And though your long bones have nothing to do with Lorca or those deaths 40 years ago in Spain, the trees fill with questions and summer. He would not want tonight another elegy. He would want me to examine the marriage of wings beneath your delicate collarbones. They breathe. The ribs of your own poems breathe. And here is our dark house at the end of the lane. And here's the one light we have kept on all year for no one or Lorca. And now he comes towards it with the 6 bullet holes in his chest, walking lightly so he will not disturb the sleeping neighbors or the almonds withering in their frail arcs above us. He does not want to come in. He stands embarrassed under the street lamp in his rumpled suit. Snow, lullaby, anvil of bone that terrifies the blacksmith in his sleep. Your house is breath.
Yeah.
It's like the wind is like coming in my window and my lawnmower is going as I read this. The poetry is coming in the room. It's breath.
Yeah, it's breath. This poem, and I realized that I've read it before because I've probably read the selected Levis like 3 times. But
so good.
It's a poem that does a lot and is very okay with negative capacity and ambiguity about what it's doing. But I think we would both agree this is probably a political poem in so much that it is about a specific event, kind of. Although it's also about events that we don't know. I mean, the you in this poem is contemporary to Levis, I assume. And while, I do a lot myself with like playing with the idea of the constructed you in lyric poems and like fucking with people about what that means. It's clearly not Lorca. Like,
right.
There's yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's an intimacy with the you, this giving of the stone. It feels a little bit like it feels like it's definitely a person, right? Maybe a lover or something like that. But it feels too like a little bit like the reader, right?
Right.
Being given a stone, and the stone reminds him of Lorca, feels like the poem itself too. I like that it's a stone too, the inert, the dead, which Lorca is, but there's something living in the inert in this poem, in Lorca as well, seems to come back to life.
Yeah, I mean, the act of in that stanza with the stone reminding one of the tense face of Lorca spitting into an empty skull, like, which also is just a great fucking image.
So good.
But it's also, in some ways, this is one of those times where I'm like, if the author is giving you anything, they might model how that you're creating meaning in the poem, and this one does that. I mean, because it's like we're dealing with an inert stone that we already have this association with a Granada graveyard that is full of dead, not just from the Spanish Civil War, but from centuries,
Right.
and of which the Spanish Civil War is a 40-year-old instance at the time of the poem's writing. And yet the stone is also like, that's an act of creation, to take that stone and see in it this image of Lorca spitting into a skull, and then wondering why he would have done that.
Right. It's very meta in the poem too, because
Right.
why would he do that? Okay, why would a poet do? It's a little bit feels like a poet doing something like that, and it feels highly symbolic and significant, but we can't know what it means. It's also like the living interacting with the dead and the inert, and spitting one's own body into the dead. There's such this back and forth between the dead and the living in this poem. But too, with the opening line, the men who killed poetry, great line break here, hated silence. Then in ellipses, and interesting, I always think of how Bachelard said that an ellipses is always an analysis. Now they have plenty, right? Hated silence, right? The men who to hate poetry is to hate silence, to hate negative capability, to hate the lack of language and speech and irony here, which I think we've touched upon already, which is that like the poem always contains that unnameable, unspeakable, and unknowable thing, negative thing, zero, that it's almost like defines it and it speaks around. Which in this poem too, in terms of the political, how Lorca was assassinated, I didn't think his body was ever found. It's interesting. He says 6 bullet holes, so it's very specific.
Yeah, I was like, it's very specific and yet also made up. Like,
yeah, there's that lying. There's that lying, but it makes right, and to the aesthetic too. Like a poet, there is such importance of aesthetics over maybe ethics or morality in poetry, right? Because somehow the beauty gets at the truth. But like a poet would be like 6 bullet holes in the chest sounds better. I don't know why, but it does.
Yeah.
And like it sounds better like right after that M dash too, right?
Right. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, there's a way in which this poem itself is also meta, because Larry Levis is also dead.
Also dead, right?
Right.
And that when I stayed up all night, I was like on meth, Larry. But yeah.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah, and given that we know how he died, drug overdose and heart attack,
Yeah.
cardiac arrest from overdose, that like there's also hints here about himself.
Right. It's very personal.
And it doesn't hide that. I mean, the way the eye function in here, but the tension between observation and creation runs throughout this poem. And I was to tie this back to the Unnameable essay that we've been referencing, which I would tell people to go read. For those of you who want to know where it's at, it's in The Age of Poets by Badiou. he talks about the where was I looking at? That the Enable Mathians, that meta poetry is kind of
Matthew.
impossible.
Meta
Um,
poetry?
yeah, which I find interesting because I'm like, but it's also all over poetry, and I was thinking about this here, that like one of the things with meta poetry is that the poem about the creation of poetry, if it's any good, almost can't stay just about that. Um, like and there are meta elements to this, absolutely, but it seems to be that like that they get reincorporated back into the poem as an act of creation itself, and I think that's what Badiou
Mhm.
is trying to get at there. That if you try to write a poem, it's just about the construction of a poem. It's gonna be about something else too, and so the pure
Mhm.
meta poem is not totally possible.
They're hard.
But
They're
this is
much less fun to read.
yeah. Uh, I would my response to meta poetry is like if it's just about writing a poem, I'm not sure that I care.
It's yeah. Yeah.
um, but that tension there is interesting because I do think without the over elements are like the modeling in the poem, this poem's almost impossible. Like I don't think it's impossible to understand, but if the poem does kind of walk you through what it is doing with itself in the images that it's giving you, like that second stanza like is almost like a key to what the poem is doing.
Yeah.
um and so that tension is interesting to me, and I like, what do you make of that tension, and why would it be so frightening to people like when they try to when they're like, oh, poetry is useless? Because I'm like, why would you think that
I know it's
in
a
a poem like
it's
this?
yeah, it's
Good.
strange to me. I can own because I grew up reading poetry, like, I just don't understand what it's like to not switch your brain a little bit to this to it's just like a small pivot, right? Is like, just let the poem happen to you, like, just surrender to it, like, you don't have to like, it's not about, like, approaching everything saying, "What does it mean?" It's like when people say to me, "What's your tattoo mean?" I'm like, if I like, "Oh, it means, strength and resilience," like, it's it just cheapens meaning so much, like, I'm like, meaning is so like, "Okay, do you have 45 minutes? Like, let's have a conversation." I don't know, like, it's so fun to think about meaning, right? But we get to uncover it together like you and I right now with this poem. But
Yeah.
I think there is I mean, you said this, like, terror of it might have something to do with the unconscious because I think poetry stirs the unconscious experience, right? Your personal experience. It it makes it it's a very intimate it's actually a very intimate overlapping of consciousnesses. So it can feel you can put a wall up immediately, right? Because you don't know how you're feeling a little bit. And that's scary. And it stirs up negative feelings too, like scare like shadowy things, death, love, all right up if death and joy are in the same poem, like, people can't handle ambivalences a lot of the time, and they spend 10 years in therapy trying to, It's like, um but actually, it's so much more satisfying too, I think. I, um Now God, it's almost like a dream too a little bit, this poem, and I think of how, uh, people think of dreams as this sort of, like, biological necessity and, like, weird "Oh, that's weird and quirky," but, like, you can glean so much about what the hell is going on in your life and, like, truths about what you need to face and look at that once you do, like, it opens you up more to experience and being in the world, and, like, I feel like I'm like, "Why do any of this?" Derek, I was having this feeling. I was like, why am I doing any of this? Like, why am I on this like pursuit of like poetry and philosophy and psychoanalysis and like song and all of it? Like, why? And I was like, there is like working toward like a kind of goodness or something, or a kind of like being in the world that feels more full and more like it has something to do with almost like it is joy, right? I think joy is a result of it, is like an excitement about it, but like understanding a bit more of the goodness of being in this world, which includes the ugliness utterly. And I don't know, when I read poems like this, where it's like, Lorca comes ambling down the dark street in his, rumpled suit and stands embarrassed under a streetlight, I feel like better about being in the world, because I feel a sense of myself as humiliated in life and fearing death. and I will, I'll be forgotten or something. And like here in this poem is like Larry Levis is dead, Lorca's dead, this horrible, war happened, like war's happening right now, and like this poem somehow sees me, and they all live on or something. Like the consciousness is contained in this poem. I'm still interacting with something greater than myself, historically is present, will keep happening. This ending line, your house is breath. This poem is breath, right? There's the meta moment. He's not in a metaphysical exploration. It just happens, and the meta poem happens on its own. It doesn't need your intention. But the poem is breath. But it's not just the poem. Our body is a house that is breath. It's the sort of architecture, the containment. The breath I think of as wind. Wind I think of as indicative of the unseen, what flows through us, what continues on, life on this planet. I don't know, song.
There's, yeah, I've been, I keep on getting hit by the contrast between the first line, the men who killed poetry, hated silence,
Yeah.
are ellipses. Now they have plenty, which is like, I'm also like, oh, that's a mean ellipses and they deserve it.
Yeah.
But the contrast is the men who killed poetry, skip to the end of the poem, your house is breath. Even the act of reading the poem makes you breathe. You have gone through this. The dead don't breathe. So if your house is breath, this is the negation of the men who killed poetry. But and like, as a poet, I'll just say, like, I have no idea if Levis actually set out to do that intentionally. I often find those kind of circular, when people talk about the neat, like, clicking, because that's a very click end, like the ending touches the beginning, like that.
So satisfying when it works.
Right.
But it is a lot of unintentional.
Right, exactly.
The more you see the poet's hand in it, the less satisfying it is. You want it to seem like an accident a little bit, right? Again, the lie, because the poet wants to, the Yeats poem, if our stitching and unstitching does not seem if it does not seem a moment's thought, all our stitching and unstitching has been for naught. Because you don't want to see, it doesn't want to seem like it should seem like a moment's thought, a breath, like it's happening right now. But I think, to your point though, is it, did Larry Levis like begin this poem knowing where it's going to end? Whereas like, it's interesting because you could kind of think of the philosopher being like, I've worked out this idea about the house's breath and silence, and I'm going to write my way to break it down into a way to understand how we interpret being. Larry Levis is just engaged. He's just letting it happen in the poem, and see, he probably started with the first line, or maybe he started with the stone, the memory of the stone, or something like that.
Yeah, I often find, it's always dangerous to deduce from your own method other people's methods, so people take that with a grain of salt. But I often find with myself that if I find a perfect click point in a poem like this, it is deliberate in that I chiseled a bunch of shit away or moved all this kind of stuff around so it would happen. But I've never been able to be like, I'm gonna start a poem here and
Yeah.
end a poem here, and it's just
Yeah.
gonna work. I've never written a poem like that in my life.
Yeah.
And if anyone can, and it also seemed natural like this, awesome, amazing. I can't do it. I don't think. And most poets I know, they find this stuff. They don't. Through the act of actually writing it and then chiseling it away or
Yeah. The
expanding it
editing.
out. Yeah, and
Yeah.
editing. They don't find it like in this preconceptualized poem in your head before you write it down.
Right. It's almost like you have like an inkling of something that's, and in the writing is the discovery of, it's like, even thinking about Rilke doing something like wanting to engage with the myth of Orpheus and wanting to reimagine an interpretation of it. I can, right, he may have set out with the not like, the more he read that text, the more he started to be like, the interpretation sort of blossoming in his head of like, wait, why did Orpheus turn around and look at Eurydice? Like, maybe it was a gift, maybe it wasn't a mistake. And then, like, knowing that you want to include that in the poem, but it always makes it harder when you want to include something. Or if there's like a story, people are like, I want to write about my trauma or something. Like, it always ends up being like so hard to do and feels so stilted and awkward because poems are just harder to plan. I find personally, right? Finding a way into something you want to say.
I agree.
Yeah. So, yeah. It's like something crazy happened to me and I want to write about it, but usually the best moves for that are, well, one move is just to be very plain about it. This is what I'm doing. But yeah, once I gave you a small stone I respected. I mean, that could have been something, a very important moment in his life that he boiled down to this one line, and he had to let go of all the narrative in order to get at the real truth of that interaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the way that we don't know why he's giving this person a stone. We don't know who this person is. We have the definite intimation of intimacy, and we also have the way in which the poetic you almost always functions as a way to be like to kind of fuck with the reader, and that the reader is both the you and not the you almost always.
Right.
Like,
Right. Right.
It's interesting you bring up Raucus. I was thinking about this in poems in other languages. I am totally. It's totally funny that you mentioned trying to translate Rauca. When I first got into poetry translation, I was obsessed with translating Rauca and Pizarnik. So because also German and Spanish were the two languages I was studying, and and they're both relatively in language scales. They're relatively close to English. Like, it's not like I have dabbled in translating poetry from like Korean, and I'm like, no, I
Mhm.
can't do that. I have no idea. Like anything I feel like I'm going to create is almost a completely new poem.
Mhm.
And I've never translated poems for publication. I've just translated them for me.
Mhm.
But even a poet like Rauca, who I think is not, I mean, he's difficult, but he's not like super difficult. And German is not English, but it's also one of the more closely related languages to English.
Yeah,
And
listening to
yet,
Germans talk, I'm always like, it sounds like people talking nonsense English.
right, yeah, exactly. Or even more so with like Dutch. I'm like, that sounds like a drunk German speaking English at me. So like, it's no offense to
But you
country
right.
Dutch listeners, but
So
still,
but you have trouble, did you have trouble with,
absolutely.
yeah, because I've
Like
heard multiple people say that Roca is one of the hardest, especially the Do We Know elegies, to translate, period.
yes, it's so hard, and you always feel like
What a testament to the poetry, you know?
Yeah,
Just I love it. I love looking at all the different translations, though, and how it shows that. Like
yeah. Well, I think the reason why I was obsessed with Pizarnik and Rilke, and there was also Nicanor Parra, the Chilean poet. Parra should be easy, by the way. Parra's like anti-poetic, straight statements. You know, it should theoretically be easy to translate into English. And maybe I'm an overthinker, but I'm like, no, it isn't. Like, I can't do it. Like I can do it, but it's not very good. And when I read so many of the translations and going through them, I'm like, oh, many of these are great poems, but it doesn't have all this in the original. And then it got me so paranoid. I mean, with German, that I was like, do I even understand German? Like, I
yeah.
think I understand German. Maybe I don't. Like, and then I'm like, do I even understand English?
Right, right.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, right, right. Even writing in your own language is like, wait a minute, do I understand? Do I understand? It's almost like the capacity of my language. It's you do like I love that. I think it was Stevens, like you have to write poetry, you have to like fall in love with words with all your capacity to love anything at all. And it's like another thing people completely forget when they're writing a poem because they're always thinking about like the narrative or like their message, right? And they can get carried away with how they're coming off and like trying to be seen a certain way or to like convey a certain message, that didactic idea. Whereas like it's like poetry is concerned with words and language, and like if you focus on how your language you're working with works, and sort of, I mean, it's, as to reiterate for the billionth time, like it's half conscious, half intuitive, or unconsciously born. Somehow something happens without, by not focusing on what you think you should focus on when you're conveying information through language. I was thinking about something I was reading, um, this book kind of about Wittgenstein and Rilke. And Wittgenstein really liked Rilke's thing poems that were like exploring, looking at objects. And he was trying to be, I think, more like slightly more objective in terms of like, how can I, Blyde talks about this too in a lot of his work, but it was like, can I just like write about an object in the world, like, and see it so intensely without informing it too much with my like personal inner world or something. Like for Rilke, it was very important for him to do this. And he wrote like the archaic torso of Apollo and the Panther poem and all these things. It was like, of course, he always ends up bringing the inner world more fully into being through this paradoxical act of looking outward. But Wittgenstein apparently hated later Rilke with his Duino elegies. Um, and similar to like or Adorno saying that like writing after Auschwitz was barbaric, and that like looking inward was like escapism that discouraged political awareness, right? And there's a couple things I'm getting at in this, but like, oh, but the important element here is that it's not just about language. There's something, for Wittgenstein, it seemed like it was more, right? He's so obsessed with words and language, but like for the poet, for Rilke, it was so much about embodiment, right? The body and landscape and world. I can't remember what I was connecting with that at first, but like, I guess the importance of words and obsessing over words and loving words, but it is a little bit too, of course, about like how we embody words and how we use words in the context of objects in this world. It's like the relationality between those things in a constellation, like become the poem. And that too, I think of that the house's breath, right? That breath is what makes the poem. So that is important too.
Well, it's interesting to me that Wittgenstein would have had an issue with the Duino allergies, in so much that like I think of Wittgenstein as this philosopher who kind of gets the problems of language in a way that other philosophers often don't, particularly from that analytic and like logical positivist tradition, which Wittgenstein isn't in, but is adjacent to. And the reason why I bring that up is he's one of these people who points out that, like, yeah, good luck defining anything or seeing a clear relationship with a word.
Yeah.
Like you'll get these relationships of resemblances, and you
I
can
think
see how the metaphor strings. But go ahead.
Well, I think the resemblance is probably what was painful for him for those later Rilke poems, is that he probably did see himself a little bit more in those poems, maybe, that, and one doesn't always like to see that
Mm,
that inner world, and it's wrestling with, different depression and spiritual crises, for an intellectual that might be hard to look at. But again, I think of Plato protesting so much about poetry, and it sort of in itself being very, um, it's almost like he wasn't wrong, and it elucidated a lot about poetry that's helpful today. And in the end, he was a poet too, or something, like he just, um, like, people, we can hate things and have it still be something we love, but we just don't say it out loud. But later we all get to be like, we're like the
yeah.
Platonic, like, rebels who, like, took Plato and, like, ran with it. And that's what he kind of wanted.
Yeah, it's actually funny. This realization when I was in my 30s that in addition to all the weird esoteric shit in Plato, which I think people underestimate and has been cleaned up, but because I'm like, no, there's all kinds of weird theology and stuff in here, and there's hidden. But
Yeah.
aside that, let's set that aside for a second. That Plato really wanted to be geometric, like
What is
there's
that?
this
Like mathematical, or?
not just mathematical, like the way geometry works. Like you find forms and you define the forms and you operate from that point forward, and the forms are assumed, they're axiomatic and a priori, and like you you get that there's this attempt to head towards the geometric way of thinking, that there's like the math, the Pythagorean, but it doesn't, he can't get there. Like it actually ends up being very poetic anyway, in the sense of like there's a lot about words, there's a lot about aporia, there's a lot about what words can't do. He, even though he's trying to get to the form, the only way he can get to the form is through weird metaphors and allegories. um like
Is this the same as the Cartesian, like, issue that we're dealing with today, where we want to the provable, measurable, scientific method to win out in terms of what's reality and what's worth focusing on, and in term, like, right, if we're eradicating the humanities from our educational system because it's not practical and has no use in our culture, are we saying that, well, right, are we saying that things must be more geometrically understood, or scientifically provable in terms of to make it valid? And does that connect to Plato's idea of the real, versus the mimetic or something?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I would say it's not exactly the same because our notions of science aren't Plato's notions of geometry, but it's the same impulse,
Right.
that ability to say we have a universal system. The thing is, anyone who studies the philosophy of science and actually empirically ties it to what scientists do realizes that, like, there isn't a singular scientific method. There
Right.
is barely an agreed upon set of definitions of what science is. And yes, there are things that are clearly kind of not science at all. But that, the people who are I always thought, you and I are roughly the same age, and I was in my 20s during the height of the new atheist movement, and they would just talk about reason all the time. And I remember like hitting those people up with like, what do you mean by reason? What is logic for you? Like, you realize there are different logical systems, right? Even in Western culture, even if I'm blacking out world culture here and we're just talking about Europe and
Yeah.
America and the Anglophone world, like, there's multiple systems of logic, and none of them can actually adjudicate whether or not their axioms are true. And
Yeah.
so what do you mean by reason? And they're like, oh no, science is just like codified common sense. And I'm like, there's nothing commonsensical about a quark.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Right.
um so
So
it's
what? Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, it always makes me wonder, like, why? What are we like feeling? I feel like this sort of like black and white or absolutism in terms of these beliefs, and not seeing the like wider subtleties of and meaning and things behind words like logic and reason. Like,
Mm.
why is it comforting maybe to have this like, this is my idea, this is the truth?
Yeah, I mean, it would well, one, I mean, just the most vulgar form of psychoanalysis I could possibly do, to feel like you could absolutely know the truth on your own deduction from your own thing, like, that's super, super, super gratifying. But also, like, I can't think of many things that are more hubristic. Like, I know how everything in the universe works because I can figure out these
Right.
laws. And I'm always fascinated, as a person who's very interested in science, and I do have some training in anthropology, which is also may or may not be a science, depending on who you talk to and what day. Um, uh, it's you hit these walls where I remember talking with a physicist when I was in graduate school, and they were talking about the math leading to this, but I was like, but how do you know that? Like, how do you actually know that, like, what you're mathematically deducing, like, I don't know, dark matter is real? Because we just historically, we have magnetically deduced all kinds of shit that has been totally made up, and we just deduced it to make the math work.
Right.
Like ether.
Well,
You know,
yeah.
I can go through all kinds of concepts. Uh,
Right.
Ptolemaic astrology, which is actually astronomy, which is actually, although both, it's kind of both, but was actually more predictively accurate than modeled correctly astronomy for a long time. And it's
Yeah.
because people just fiddled with the observations to make it work, and yet the basic substructure was entirely wrong.
Mhm.
um so I find that interesting, and it's funny because I deal in Marxist land, and Marxists really want to collapse the normative and the descriptive, like, just it's the great German idealist dream to, like, get rid of the distinction between the normative and the descriptive. We all just want to, like, tell Hume to go fuck himself, and I find that both, like, an interesting thing, but I'm like, it almost always fails. And what's, like, even Marx, when he tries to do it, a lot of his more interesting things, even politically, is when he can't, and he kind of knows he can't, and it leads to whole projects. Like, some of the most important projects in Marxism are him trying to, like, reconcile that tendency.
To
Um, to under
explain.
to well, okay, so in Marx, there is this kind of assumption that, for example, communism is a necessity because these are the ways the law of history works. But he's constantly revising in his letters and whatnot, the fact that his early predictions don't hold out. And eventually, like, Das Kapital is basically a project in response to the fact that his initial assumptions in the 1850s didn't hold.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, the most important document in, like, left-wing political economy is him in some ways trying to work out in a systemic way uh why he was not correct in his initial assumptions about what was going to lead to an immediate revolution in Europe and start leading to the overthrowing of capitalism. And even there, Capital is a very fascinating book, and I get very, as a poet who's also kind of a Marxist, when I read stuff like the poetic reading of Marx's Capital, I do kind of want to throw those books against the wall. But I will say it is interesting to me, though, that even in a book like that, he has to reach for metaphors all the damn time. And like, there's no way out of it, even for someone who's trying to systemically work this out. And I find that fascinating and an interesting problem. And it's a tension in Marxist, and I think that tension in the Western Marxist tradition. I hate that term, by the way, but I'm just going to use it today for simplicity's sake. They often turn to psychoanalysis to deal with the kind of a priori there, like the weird tension between these social movements that they want to put in laws and the fact that even Marx doesn't think they're explanatory of individuals, and there's a tension in that, and the way the social world is creating the individual, but also can't be reduced to it. Like Marx admits, like, I can talk about class politics, but I also know in the individual person, their social class will not dictate their politics. Like, I'm only talking about the way this works in aggregate. And when people hit that, they have to try to reconcile that difference. Like, how is it that this can be vaguely true in aggregate? And I would agree that it mostly is. And yet in the individual, it's not super predictive at all. And how do we handle that? Like, how do we deal with that ambiguity in our own lives? Like, we all know people who have politics that seem against their interest or whatever, and not just in the obvious ways that like liberals talk about, that I think is usually false anyway, but in other ways that are complicated. You're just like, okay, well, why is that? I can't totally explain it in terms of even just raw self-interest, what is going on here, or at least the self-interest isn't obvious in a way that it is in class aggregates. Like, what in the self is this appealing to? And to tie that back into poetry, it's interesting to me because poetry makes this to me really, really obvious. Because in one way, poetry is historically an elite institution, and yet also when you look at like oppressed peoples and oppressed communications, poetry's super vital to that. Like, so there's like a double position even in that. I mean, I think about this today in some case, and maybe I'll this is another way where I think that didactic poetry is often misleading, because some of them want to speak for a political truth that's absolute and we can just state it, and yet also there's usually an irony of imposition of a poet doing that, because even though I myself come from a working class background, when I went through the MFA system, I will admit, like, oh my God, there's so many like upper middle class dweebs that I have to deal with in this scenario. And some of them, ironically, and I hated it, I used to really resent it actually, are really good poets and actually say things that move me, even though I'm like, oh God, they're an upper middle class dweeb. And yet there's also a way in which some of the poetry that is most about politics seems to be about erasing that tension. Because I'm like, well, for a lot of people, this is something that you can come through organically. I think about like the African-American Black poetry tradition, which is like super big and has a long tradition going back to slavery, and yet also the tension and like, yeah, but there is a lot of social codes in poetry that you have to have a lot of leisure time to
but isn't
go ahead.
A lot of leisure time to get trained at for the poetry?
Right.
No, I mean there's a lot of issues you're bringing up, and I feel like there is a lot of tension on this idea of poetry as elitism. It's funny because whenever I had this, like, I was thinking about it this morning when I woke up, actually, that when I was interviewed in my local free paper about becoming the Vermont Poet Laureate, like, the interviewer focused, I was talking kind of like a lot of like kind of what we're talking about, like, in like the sort of metaphysical exploration, like that poetry like delves deep into complex relations with the psyche and with the other, and it's my personal history within all these things. But like this like angry guy like wrote to the paper that like I wasn't writing poetry for the people, that I was like some like, even though he wasn't talking about my poetry, it was like kind of just talking, I was just talking about like my relationship to poetry, not necessarily my poems, right? Which I find are fairly accessible. Um, but this, his sort of like caveat was like poetry should be enjoyable and poetry should be for the people. And like you're in some elitist and in a high tower. And I'm like, I'm really not. Like I grew up on food stamps and like I'm self-taught. Like I don't have a PhD or anything. So there's this, and the more I thought about it, I was like, first of all, it seemed very generalizing about what the people want and what the people can handle. And I was wondering, like, is this like what is this idea of like poetry as this idea of poetry as like this elite leisure thing is, it's hard because I'm talking to you who's like deep into the Marxist theories and all of it, like, which I'm not. So, right. So I can't really speak to the idea of like,
but I'm also a poet. I'm also a person who chose to be a poet who grew up on food stamps. So
exactly.
like
So you're kind of perfect. Yeah.
Right.
You're kind of perfect. Right. So this idea of like things you write have to be useful and like you have to be seen as working to be like a good person or something, or not like morally selfish. I wonder like this poetry like goes back to like the unfathomable roots of a human past, right? It has somehow endured all this time. And like even talking about the history of poetry is very difficult, right? Because of that. And because of it's globally manifested differently in all these different cultures and people. And I think yes, like having time to write poetry is a luxury, but like there's plenty of poets who were like in Russian prisons who were like wrote poems on toilet paper too. Like people will write poetry no matter what. And I think we should prize a kind of being. I think we should have a society where we see the leisure time needed to make art as important for the workings of the society and the culture. Because it actually is still work, even if it looks like leisure to other people. It is work. It's just different kind of, it's not like physical labor, but like, that's one thing.
Well, although I will also add in our society, like
Yeah,
only about 16% of the population does physical labor. Like it's
right,
just,
exactly. Yeah,
like,
right.
it's
Who's
just,
these people doing physical labor?
it's like,
Yeah,
I mean, it's one of those things. I was joking with someone and I was like, you think as a teacher, I wouldn't be doing that much physical labor, but actually when I moved from being a teacher in person to a teacher online, I at first gained 30 pounds because I didn't even realize how much physical labor I was doing.
exactly. You were moving. Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
moving
yeah,
around all the time and lifting up stuff.
yeah,
I mean, it's just,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I think about that a lot. And I also think about like these assumptions about who speaks for the quote workers or who speaks for the people. I mean, the people's even more nebulous, but like, because I'm like, okay, I get the poetry should be enjoyable, but like, I don't know that we always know what people find enjoyable. My grandfather was literally like was a bricklayer with like an 8th grade education, and he read Blake like
Mhm.
for fun.
Right, right.
Like, so
Yeah.
it's just, and actually, he was one of the people who got me into poetry as a child. And I'm just like, so this
I love that.
notion
Yeah.
that it's just this highfalutin thing confuses to me. And while poetry books aren't cheap, I just want to like point out poetry is a cheap activity to do.
Mhm.
Like, it's hard to master, but it's like I just need paper and some writing utensils. Or today, I don't even necessarily need paper. Like, it doesn't. I mean, that's what's the weirdest. That's like okay, if I'm a sculptor, right? Like, there's a lot of equipment I need, and that costs money. If I'm a
Yeah.
poet, I actually don't need that much equipment. Like,
You don't. And right,
yeah.
and in terms of money as well, like there's this, our culture isn't able to comprehend work that isn't about making money. This
Yeah.
is an issue with poetry because people are like, "I don't understand how you're a poet because it doesn't make money." If I have to hear this again, I'm like, I mean, it's actually a great I actually embrace it now because I have an opportunity to talk about why that's bullshit. But, like, yes, I mean, a poet will do anything they have to make money, and I'll never be rich. That's fine. You know, I'm, like, not here on this earth to make money. Um, but it's interesting too that people will say, "Well, poetry is not like poetry on the best-selling New York Times bestseller list that's making money is now seen as legitimate, whereas poetry that's not on the bestseller list, that's not making money, is not seen as legitimate." And what that poetry looks like that's on the bestseller list oftentimes is people might say it's political, like Amanda Gorman, for instance, or something like
Mhm.
that. Now, the interesting problem with someone like her who she actually can write, but the politicization of her poetry has watered it down to what you were saying in the beginning about what you hate about political poetry was that it's so surface level and doesn't really take stances in terms of, like, clear visions of, like, what's happening here. It's more like, "Oh, this was, like, needed for, like, the Biden administration to have, like, look like, a certain way as they were, like, entering into this, bullshit phase of our democracy," right? Um,
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that, like, it's 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 it's, like, bourgeois, like, it's, like, made, not too dark, not too joyful. It's got a little bit of emotional edge and, like, suffering, but, like, it's not complicated. It can be liked by a lot of people. It can be liked by a mass society, and then it's a bestseller, right? It's difficult and now and it's understandable, right, too. There's that problem with people. It almost makes me wanna cry, Derek, because 'cause I'm like, people think that not being understandable right away in terms of what we were talking about with meaning means you're elitist.
Yeah, that is weird to me, and funnily enough, but I do find it kind of not. You can't overgeneralize here, but I
No.
will say a lot of the people who say that to me are middle class. So
Yeah.
it's like I'm
It
like,
yeah.
I don't get that a lot. Like I teach high school. I teach creative writing online to and in public school system to like I mean way too many kids at a time, but uh in a demographic set that goes from McKinney-Vento homeless to upper middle class.
Mhm.
Not there's not a lot of like really rich people in Utah, but that's the bracket in which I deal with. And I can tell you that it's a lot of the poorer kids who can get into this stuff, and they don't really care if they understand it or not. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like once you give them permission to have fun with it, and I'm like, no, really, I'm not. It's not that you can't be wrong in an interpretation of a poem, but it's kind of hard. Like if you
Yeah.
can find it in there at all, if there's something you can latch onto to justify what you're saying, you can do whatever. And also, this is true when you write your own poetry.
Right.
Um, and is
I mean,
everything that kids write amazing? No, but is it all? Interestingly, is it all comprehensible? Only when they use Chat GPT to do it. So, like,
yeah.
um, it's
Yeah.
it's it's an interesting problem, and I find that like I will tell you what I think about when people tell me if they want all their poets to understand it. I'm like, and to be like enjoyable or use form perfectly. I'm like, Chat GPT can do it, and those things are soulless. Like
Mhm.
I always know when a student is cheated and used because I'm like, this is both pristine and meaningless, not in
Yeah.
that it's meaningless in that it doesn't have semantic content, but it's meaningless in like it's the most generic semantic content I've ever seen in my damn life. No human being would be just boring.
Right.
Like, um, and I find that fascinating.
Mhm.
Um, because it does illustrate something about that ambiguity. It's like, okay, if I give you, like, we have a technology that can give you exactly what you want without even a human being behind it, and I'm pretty sure you don't actually want it.
Right.
Like,
Right.
um, so,
I know, it's
uh,
like you can't like, why cheat when you can do anything?
right. Yeah,
You can do
it's funny.
anything. Doing anything is but some, it's not I've learned to, like, I don't need to, like, have everybody read poetry, like, I don't need everyone to get it. It's always gonna be slightly marginalized, and I think it kind of has to be that way, and I'm okay with that. I think this anxiety of getting everybody to like poetry, maybe yeah, maybe in the future we will have, like, one of those, like, Greek societies where it's integrated into our belief systems and our politics and everything, but, like, for now, I just doing things like this, you and I, like, small groups of people, I go around, I do these little, talks around Vermont, like, in libraries and stuff, and these just yeah, a lot of the middle class, upper middle class there, let's say, and older people, and their knowledge of the the possibilities that I see in poetry, um, is so limited, and then after I talk to them, it's like they feel so moved, and I can see it on their faces, and I can see how there's this part of that part of the soul that needs and embraces and wants that, and those even in these small groups of people in my small state in this country, like, I feel like it makes a difference. It works its way out, even not to connect it to a psychoanalysis, which feels like will be like, "Who cares about your little problems in this?" It is a privilege to have a good analyst. It's really hard to find one, right? And it's expensive. There's scales, but, like, that is a privilege. But if you can get one, it seems like the more that you become willing to do that work, and a lot of it is poetic, and personal, it bleeds outward. It makes a difference on a wider scale. I know it does. And it's like, sometimes you do have to start with that. I think, right, the individual, and talking about the social and the political, it's like the individual came first, right? I mean, or in the beginning was the relation, as Martin Buber says, like, in the beginning was an individual and another individual. And, like, how are we going to communicate and deal with and live together? And, like, we're infinitely separate, right? You and I are
Right.
infinitely separate and unknowable. I can't know your mind. I can never really know your experience. The only way to capture it is in art. It's like that's that moment where I feel this overlap in consciousness. I don't think the political, the city, the beliefs catered to a mass of people can ever do that. But I think the individual is first and then comes the societal.
Yeah, I mean,
Somehow. But like you were
it's
saying
interesting.
before, like the society could deal with the issue of the individual, um, or that it breeds an idea of the individual, which is what we see happening in America, is like every man for himself. Don't, like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and, like, don't ask the government for help, and that kind of shit is just lies. But
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating. I think about so it's funny if when people listen to me, they think my background is historian, which is actually kind of hilarious because I've taken like 2 history classes in my life. I read a ton of history, but like,
right, right,
I am, and I've even spoken at history conferences and like pissed off historians by admitting that, like, yeah, I took 2 classes in college and I've really, like, I just write about this stuff. Uh, and also what you do is not that different than what I do as a literary scholar. And they're
right,
like,
exactly. Yeah,
but like, no, it's not. It's not that different. You deal with you deal with archival text and like material culture in ways that I don't necessarily. But once you get into stuff like intellectual history, we're almost doing the same thing.
right, right,
Um, but my point about that is that a lot of what I'm interested in, and regards to this stuff in language is the way self emerges. And one of the things that I can tell you that I feel about American culture is, on one hand, there's this obvious paradox that everyone who talks about individualism all like would love. Their idea of society actually is not individualistic at all. It's like a church community,
Right.
which is hilarious to me. But the other thing is that I think the whole binary, and this also shows up on the left, between the individual and collective is the exact wrong way
Mhm.
to think about it. Like there's a
Mhm.
dialectical relationship there. And I do think, in a very real way, that 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 dialectic is relational. That the
Mhm.
relationship is primary, and that what the social is the aggregate of relationships.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
which has patterns and meanings, and they go beyond those individual relations. But if you try to understand like a collective society versus an individualist society or something like this, and I do, that's not a completely meaningless claim. But like,
Individual society.
yeah, our collective society, I'll give you, and we're always taught, for example, that East Asian societies are collectivist, and that
Okay.
collective good is prioritized, which is true, but also like individuality and individual relation is actually still super important.
Mhm.
And if you don't believe that, then you have to deal with like, well, why are there so many honor suicides? That's not about collective good at all. That's about individual status and not being able to deal with the loss of it. So clearly, there is something still individualistic in these collective relations, in these societies that you view as more collectivist. They also tend to like poetry, as a side note,
Mhm.
but
Mhm. Good.
it is something there that is relational, and bracketing off the collective from the individual as if the two do not inform each other seems to completely lead you to some very weird places, because we talk about poetry, lyric poetry in particular. We is always presented as like, oh, that's an individual art, and in a way it is. Like, you're dealing with the emotions and feelings of one human being, but you're dealing with it, you're approaching it. Like, the fact that I put it on paper and put it out there in the world to be socially engaged with has made it an approachable thing that is no longer in my control. And you go back to the so-called collective poetries, Homer,
Yeah, even I
Beowulf.
was gonna say the sort of romanticism versus classicism.
Right. Well, but the classical poetry is pretty fucking individual and idiosyncratic too. I mean, that's like the thing. Like, going through Homer, and I mean, not so much Homer at all, because I don't think Homer's one person probably, but like,
But there was,
um,
like, specific people's names where it was like, this was, his deed that he did, it was, like,
right,
very yeah.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
very individual and very idiosyncratic.
Mhm.
Like, there is a voice to the Odyssey. There is a voice to the Iliad, and they're kind of specific. I mean, like, even compared to other classical poets, like, I can tell the difference between Homer and Ovid.
Mhm. Yep.
Like, so are between like, um uh Lucretius, I guess, who's kind of a poet, is also kind of a philosopher, and
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
uh
Heraclitus.
yeah, Heraclitus. Like, we can
And can
put
you
this
imagine
together.
if I mean, right, so people, like, talk about the poetic voice,
Hmm.
right? The persona, not, the speaker, when we're in workshop, we'll say the speaker,
Hmm.
in acknowledgement of the fact that poetry is out of the self, right? Especially, let's say, like, the modern poem too, versus the collective poem. Um, right, back when, one was like a gleeman writing poems for the for the rich,
Hmm.
mayor and his, tales. But, yeah, I think the poetic voice is yours and not yours, and and I think it gets exactly what you were just saying, where it was like the individual and the collective are in a intrapsychical relationship, right? That they are opposites and the same at the same time, right? Not the same, but there's something about them that is one thing. Um,
Mhm.
and it is interesting to think about how that's embodied in the poem. That this is a Larry Levis poem, but like it's in Larry Levis adopts this voice of Larry Levis to write these poems in the speaker's voice, mining his autobiographical experience, but he's also in conversation with history and he's also in conversation with other poets. And
Right.
right, so it's like it's I always say this when I'm sort of like getting people to like forget what they think they know about poetry, but I love to emphasize the fact that yes, it is an autobiographical, let's say nonfiction genre, but it is also utterly fiction and neither at the same time. So it's unique in that way. It's sort of the original genre of no genre. Um, and I think it almost like, and you had asked me in the email, like maybe even like what classical poetry can offer contemporary poetry. And maybe it is something like about this, like maybe too much, I see us clinging to our ideas of like the self and like
Mhm.
the autobiography. And like what I've found getting out of reading philosophy and reading classical literature is that engaging with um a greater collective literature and world is like that looks at first like has nothing to do with me, taps into something that actually gets closer to me understanding myself than I would plumbing the supposed almost like photographic idea of Bianca and I and autobiography and experience. Because I think, this is why one of the reasons why I love reading Jung too, is that like it does tap into a sort of collective unconscious that is ancient, and these symbols and images that continue to come up and are shared between us are, when I read a poem and I see that too in the poem, I think, I'm an individual and I am shared in this experience that's sort of innate, like with the other, right? And
Mhm.
then we're born a collective, maybe. It was like we're born of it. We're all one
Yeah.
portion.
Well, I always think about like I don't go too much into Lacanianism because Lacanian psychoanalysis is a psychoanalysis I admittedly don't understand, but and that's after studying it for years and informally and being self-taught in it, but being like going through it and being like, I don't know, this may be meaningful, but I'm not quite sure.
Right.
Um,
I think
I
that's
often
how you
read,
should read it.
yeah.
I think you should
Well, I
read
read
it like
Lacan like a
poetry.
poetry. Yeah, I
Yeah,
do.
exactly. That's the only way to read Hegel too for me.
Um,
Right.
there's some Hegel scholars who just deeply hurt, but yes,
I'm
that
I'm
was
okay
how I
with
got
that.
through Hegel. I actually was like, um, my big freeing moment was Hegel was being like, if this thing seems like it's a pun or a metaphor and it's invoking the religious and the rational at the same time, it's because it is, and just go with it.
Hell yeah.
Like,
I mean, that's the
like
paradox. That's the poet's paradoxes, right?
right, yeah, and it's just and as I was like, having that poetry gift makes Hegel a little bit like, yeah, he means everything you think he means, and probably stuff he doesn't even know he means. Like,
Exactly.
um, and it's really freeing in that way.
So
There
much.
are philosophers you can't do that with, but
Yeah.
Hegel's not one of them.
Well, yeah,
Um,
and Lacan either. Very fun if you read it like that.
yeah, I mean,
But to your point,
yeah. To my point, to actually stay on topic for a second. Is that there is this way in like the Lacanian mirror phase. Actually, and this also goes back to Hegel's encounter with the other, like the self, the unhappy consciousness tells you what the self is. And the unhappy consciousness is not possible until you realize there's an other in the world who is not you. You don't have a sense of you as an I until you encounter the other as a not I.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and it is the very instantiation of encountering the other in a relation that makes the I possible. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and thus the self is both absolute and contingent simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard
God.
for people to deal with. To like
I feel
think
like I'm
like,
in that right now.
right, like you just think about like the reality of the fact that like you and I can be very sincere with each other and have a conversation, and it, you know, and it is, and we were dealing with selves, and I think it can be completely organic and honest, and yet I go have a conversation with someone else, and that is going to change the nature of the I. It's going to change the nature of the mask I use, and
Mhm.
that does not necessarily mean I am being inauthentic in any of
Right.
those like
Isn't
engagements.
that freeing? I mean, that we are multiple selves and that we are constantly changing every second. I mean, there's something incredibly freeing about that. But I have to keep remembering that. I forget it all the time because I think this this like feeling I have these moments of feeling such profound inauthenticity and that I'm fake or something, and, like, usually it is in relation with the other that I really care about maybe too, or, like, I want to be authentic with, or that, like, maybe it's, moments like this or something like that, although I feel very authentic with you right now. Um, but these horrible moments of, like, actually in private, right, where I'm like, "Wait a minute, what if I'm a big fucking fake liar? Like, this is me, I'm never me. I'm never me. Where am I? When can I be me?" And it's so chilling, but then you're like, "Yeah, that's probably true," and that's okay. Like, we keep falling in and out of so-called authenticity, and inauthenticity maybe is part of an authenticity.
Right. Well, I think the character mask is important. I'm not going to get too deep because I can go all modern social criticism on this and talk about like the way people present themselves and confuse their character mask with themselves in some fundamental
That's where it
way.
gets dangerous, yeah.
Right. But I do think like I don't think character masks are necessarily being inauthentic or fake. And um
Re
I guess they are constructed. I will say that. But then you don't always know when you're constructing something either. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
which is why
like,
analysis and introspection is important.
right. And I think to tie it back to poetry a bit, poetry is where that construction, I mean, literally it's in the word. We are making, it's poesis, we're making
Right,
stuff.
right.
Um, but the what we're also often doing is we're making stuff that is beyond us and often like doesn't have an obvious reason for being. And I think about this all the time. To big it back to that idea of the art is useless or the art as elite. And I'm
Yeah,
like, well, I don't know, man. Every human culture I've ever encountered, going back to like before the European Paleolithic, seems to have some kind of art and or seemingly useless thing that they are doing that
yeah.
indicates some sort of meaning, even if it's only like putting ochre and color on dead people.
Right,
But
right.
and and the reason I bring that up is it's what we have evidence for. But
Mhm, mhm.
like, it seems like that's universal. Like even hunter gatherers with like low surplus do that shit. I don't
Mhm,
know
mhm.
like why you don't like why this idea that something is not totally utilitarian seems so foreign to people. It baffles me. That does seem almost uniquely modern as
It does
wanting
seem
everything to
modern.
be. Yeah.
Yeah, it does seem modern. I think a lot of our ideas about language too seem very modern. Now that I've learned more, it's like,
Mhm.
"Oh, this was not the way it always was." Like, people didn't think like this, but, like, this changes. Like, there's something right now where we think, "Oh, this is the way this is the good thing. This is the good way to live that's universal and has always been, that we must keep working all the time." Well, who's telling us that? Um, are you doing something useful?
Yeah.
Are you contributing? Are you doing, you know? We don't want you to sit around thinking about if, the nature of living and being in a society and what it means to be an individual. We don't want you contemplating that in a chair outside in front of a tree, thinking about the importance of trees, thinking about like our relationship to nature and if we should be treating nature the way we are treating nature. It's like, I mean, it's political to even engage your consciousness with nature in a way, it's like because it risks or it shouldn't be political, but it's being made political because but that's not what I wanted to say. I can't remember now.
It happens to me too all the time.
It was something about what you were just saying.
I think it is actually kind of fitting that when we go to describe the relationship between poetry and political, like, and I think we're both doing it. We're like running around in recursive circles because there's like not a. It is both obviously relevant and obviously a political act and obviously not, and what that means seems to be a point of constant slippage. Like we
Mhm.
can say the personal is political, and I personally will go no, and also yes, and
Yeah,
that
yeah.
and that that answer really pisses people off. Actually, look on all sides of that equation because I'm just like, well, in some sense, absolutely not, and in another sense, of course it is. Like, of course, your politics can't be removed from your personal stuff, and vice versa. And also, when you try to, you're usually hiding things that are uh, deeply contradictory about yourself and your politics. I mean, the origins of that term in the feminist movement was just like all the dudes who had good public statements about women, yeah, and we're good on that rhetorically, are even really good on it publicly in terms of policy, but then we're like wife beaters and shit.
Mhm, mhm. Yep, yep.
That's the origins of the term, and yeah,
God, yeah.
you know, um,
I feel like, in thinking about, like, the personal is political, but even that was a political movement of people that wasn't actually a person. I see what of course, it was a necessary movement for exactly the reasons you're saying, but, like, I guess what I'm getting at, it was like there was almost something depersonalizing about making it political or something,
right.
And, um, again, feel like there's so much, um I can't help but constantly come back to this, uh, avoidance, that we can use the political to avoid the personal or something, like or we can use the political in order to continue to, like, be didactic or, like, point the finger at the other and, like, make things, divisive. At the same time, like, there are real political stakes at
Mhm.
work, and that the poem is a voice, and it like I was saying at the beginning, like, it's it holds emotional resonance for people, and so it is an opportunity for unheard voices to find voice, and, um, that can sway people, that can have that can make change, like, there's so many. It's hard. Let's say this too. It's hard to write good political poetry. It's hard to write poetry in general, right? People say they don't like poetry. I'm like, I don't like most poetry either. The fun thing about loving poetry is that you're constantly on the lookout for poems you love that speak to you and that speak to the issues that you care about too, right?
Mhm.
Um, but there's probably the first poems ever uttered when language came into being. we're in a sense political, and that there's a complex and, like you said, slippery relationship with the political that has been going on since the dawn of man. And we know what, when we say political poem, what we're talking about in terms of like genres within poetry. There's specific contemporary political poems that take political stances on issues of usually the oppressed, on the side of the oppressed, although I was just reading about some ridiculous Republican conservative formalist poets who are so hilariously cringe. Yeah, but I love, I think thinking about the political and the poem is, Derek, is a really important and good discussion that doesn't have one answer. Like, we get to keep thinking about what poetry is and does, and what the political is and does, and how, you know.
I think I'm going to end this conversation on a reflection on some poets that I didn't think I was going to bring up, but I always think about the high modernist, Pound, Eliot. They were political poets. Their politics were, by and large, terrible. In some cases, outright fascistic. In other cases, not outright fascistic, but pretty close.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think about like the Pizan cantos, which are weirdly, you can read them as a moment where Pound does side with the oppressed. And there's all these other, you know, weird historical, bizarro context around that. Like Emmett Till's dad is in the same prison as Pound when that's going on. And like, there's just all this stuff that shows up in those poems that can be read in a variety of ways. And that is always like set with me with when you encounter a really good poet that doesn't share your politics at all. And like somehow it still speaks to you. And then you encounter poets, bunches of Marxist poets, whose politics that you are supposed to agree with, and you're just like, oh my God. Just like, this is so terrible. I mean, I will mention a poet who I think is actually good, but who I don't love. And I should. I mean, like, and it's Brecht.
I was just going to say, is it Brecht? Because I just bought the collected Brecht, and I'm like, I can't find a poem I love.
Right. I bought for the same reasons.
I was like, oh, this looks perfect. And then I was like, oh, but I don't like anything. But it's so big. I know.
Yeah, well, I was thinking that.
Yeah, it's so
I have
funny.
the collected Brecht over there, and I'm like, I'm supposed to like Brecht. I'll even try it in German.
It looks like such a good book, right? It's so well designed. It's got all these intros. Like,
yeah, I have that exact same edition.
I was like, oh, is this like an issue of translation or something? But there's something in the music that is lost or something.
I've been told that, like, I speak German, but I do not speak German like a native speaker at all. If people who listen to my show knows that, I mispronounce German all the time. So I don't know if there's something I'm not getting, and people who speak German often tell me there are stuff to Brecht that's like really hard to translate. But
so is Rilke. And
yeah, I was gonna say, but I get Rilke, and I get
Holderlin and Nerval
and Goethe and
Goethe. Yeah, I mean,
there's
so many great German poets. Like, the Germans, I don't know what the fuck, the Germans really churned them out.
Schrekel. Yeah, it's funny because it's also not a language people think about as being super poetic, and yet it kind of is.
My Jewish mother grew up, you know, kind of shitting on the Germans to me, and I love this new opening up for me. I mean, psychoanalysis kind of started it because with Freud and Jung. I mean, Austrian, but still.
Yeah, still German though.
So
like,
still spoke German. Yeah.
Right.
And Rilke, of course, yeah. But who also had such a fraught relationship with his German language, and Salon too. I mean, it's fraught for sure. But yeah, but the German romantics. Anyway, I interrupt you. We're just tangent now.
No, it's
But before
go
we
ahead.
end as well, I was like, well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
An interesting political poem that everybody was sharing recently was in the New York Review called 82 Sentences, each taken from the last statement of a person executed by the state of Texas since 1984
You're right.
by Joe Clock. I'm not going to read it because it's too long, right? I feel like dick not reading it, but an interesting, different kind of idea was like the found poem being a poem. Where's the reader intention there? Where's the voice there, right? To adopt all these other voices of people who are dead from a very politically conservative state, which executes more than any other state, and this being a very emotionally charged political issue in our culture right now, and then having this poem, I mean, I don't know what to say about it except that. Oh, and then in the editorial note has the names of everybody whose lines they
Yep.
were. Wow, I didn't see that part before. But it's a incredibly, moving poem for all the things and I think, in terms of thinking about the didactic too, is like, it's not telling you how to feel, it's just presenting the language of the people who, and it's interesting too, because it makes you think about the idea of a last statement and the way that there's this weird tradition of like giving people a chance to use language before they die and to make a statement in words, and what comes out of people in that moment, um, speaks volumes on its own.
Yeah, it's reading that poem. I'm just looking at it right now. It's kind of amazing how by pairing these statements together, some of them seem pretty profound, some of them seem pretty cliche, and yet
Mhm,
when you read them together, there's an effect they have on each other.
mhm, mhm,
Yeah, we can't read the whole poem. I agree with you, Sloan, but I'll like read just a little snippet of it. Uh, this here is a tragedy. They're fixing to pump my veins with a lethal drug the American Veterinary Association won't even allow to be used on dogs. I should not have to be here. I'm not a killer. I know how it looks, but I didn't do it. I didn't kill my life. I didn't kill those drug dealers. I did not murder your loved ones. I am sure he died unjustly, just like I am. I have done everything to prove my innocence. If I am paying my debt to society, I am due a rebate and a refund. Everybody has problems. I allowed the devil to ruin my life. I was a kid in a grown man's world. I was sick, afraid, and looking for love in all the wrong ways. I messed up, made poor choices, but I am not guilty of this crime. And yeah, all those are individual self-contained statements, but when they're paired together like that, they're in dialogue with each other in a way that's really disorienting. And I agree with you, it doesn't really tell you how to feel about this. I mean, it can be seen as a protest against the death penalty, surely, but actually it doesn't even say that.
no,
Like,
yeah,
um and I think that's interesting, and comparing that to Gorman. I like you. I try to give Gorman a break because while I accused her Biden poem of sounding like a political version of Rupi Kaur, which I think I still stand by as a statement. Having read some of her other work, which is not the work that sells well, she's actually not that. Like not in general. And I've actually been told by people who have met her that she has a very like humble and kind of sad awareness of like how being a best-selling poet being an inaugural poet that's supposed to is going to like color her reception. And even though she's best-selling, she knows too that that's actually an ephemeral thing. I mean, one of the funny things about looking at poetry on the bestseller list, like, and it's not that it's all bad, or it's not that it's not of merit. I don't want to be that. I think that is an elitist sentiment, but
mhm,
like, so little of it actually gets remembered. There are stuff that is, but so little of that is remembered 5 years out. Like, I was looking at it and like in the '90s, what was the best-selling poet? It was Jewel. Like,
I
you
remember
know,
that.
yeah,
I remember it well, A Knight Without Armor.
right. Like, it's just, and it's not, and like, I'm not saying that the
Well,
Jewel poems have no merit, but like, they're pretty ephemeral.
yeah, but I thought that went without saying in terms of the bestseller list, right?
Right.
It's not indicative, I guess. I guess the point is like people think that when they think is poetry relevant, they're like, is it on the bestseller list? And like, it doesn't actually. I guess what they mean is it are people buying it? Do people want to read poetry on a large scale? But they're not saying, is it good poetry in a way? Like that's sort of that's the implication, I guess, is like good poetry sells. But it's not quite that. There's like there's more at work in terms of like what sells this. Um
Yeah,
yeah,
well, a
and
lot of these people wouldn't want
some
to read Rupi Kaur either. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I know I'm picking on Rupi Kaur, but just because she's so best-selling, like, um, it's like, okay, what you want exists. I mean, like, there's plenty of Instagram poetry from 10 years ago that you can go into the Barnes and Nobles and find, and it
yeah,
sells. It sells better than poetry historically has.
yeah.
Um, but we don't
Ugh,
remember hardly any of it.
right.
Like,
Right. It's not
um,
it's not gonna stand the test of time. Right.
yeah, like, and
God,
yeah,
what if it did? What if it was like the only thing that survived and they were like, this is what they all read?
it's just Billy Collins and Rupi Kaur.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
um, yeah, it is it's funny. I was thinking about that too when we were talking about difficulty, because I'm like, yeah, it's not like poetry that come. Some of the hardest poetry I've ever read has nothing to do with MFA programs, for example. It's just like, if that's what you're associating it with, like difficult poetry comes out of like academic poets. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. Like, I've
It
read some
do
really hard poems that are not by academics at all.
I
Like,
mean, the MFA, I teach in an MFA right now, and I love my students so much, but, like, it's not an elitist situation at all. Like, everybody is just so, like, we're all just so grounded in, like, being normal people. But my issue actually, having taught over the years and loving teaching in MFAs, is actually I find one of my biggest issues with MFAs is that they're not rigorous enough by far. Like, you're paying all this money to just have a total crapshoot of a teacher. You don't no idea how it's gonna be actually, unless you already have studied with that teacher before. But, like, I wish if my dream is to sort of like I want to start a school that is having these kinds of conversations and creative writing classes, and we're reading a lot of different kinds of texts. We're reading a diverse group of poets from around the world. Like, we're reading things in translation, like we're reading philosophy, like we're reading psychoanalysis, like we're reading texts that explore different like spiritual, explorations and histories and things like that. And I think that for what people pay for an MFA and to get that degree, like, it could be even more rigorous. But that it doesn't I don't know if that has to do with difficulty. Like, I don't know, like, in terms of difficulty, like, difficulty to whom? I'm not, to the mass market, like, um, shouldn't things be difficult to understand in terms of, like, like, does everybody have to understand everything at all times? And like, what does that mean? Like, shouldn't people work a little harder to understand things? Isn't that about being like the work? Like, talk about the work. Like, the work isn't maybe there's other kinds of work. Like, we have to work at understanding things. And that's the fun part. It's actually not knowing, but moving towards knowing. That's what I've learned anyway.
yeah,
We
I think
gotta go. But yeah.
that's a good place to stop. But thank you so much for your time. Where can people
Yeah.
find your work, Bianca? It's
Yeah,
all over the place, but
my poetry books are published by Tin House, and the newest one should be available wherever you buy your books. And um, I do a lot on Twitter and some on Instagram. I have a website, but
And
I
your
also run the
website.
Ruth Stone
Go ahead.
House. Yeah, the literary nonprofit I run is called Ruth Stone House, and we do classes, and I have my own podcast called Ode Psyche, which is poetry and consciousness, sort of exploring, and yeah.
All right, that's awesome. I am actually gonna look up Ode Psyche because I'm always looking for good poetry podcast, and there were a lot more 10 years ago than there are now, for a variety of reasons. One is the Poetry Foundation making a stupid statement, but another is
What did they do?
it was them being too concessionary to Zionism in one of their statements, and then like half their staff quit.
Oh, that's right.
They
That's right.
went,
Yeah. You mean when he
like,
left? Yeah.
yeah.
That's so weird you brought that up. I was just thinking about that today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, weirdly, it also meant like 7 or 8 fairly established poetry podcasts went away overnight. Like, it was
Yeah.
just, so I find that fascinating. But anyway, thank you for coming on.
Yes, thank you for having me. I
And
love
I
what
hope,
you're doing.
yeah, thank you a lot. And people should definitely check out your work. We didn't talk about it, but I really like it. I also think I like your grandmother's work too.
Mhm.
So because I believe I have one of her books that you may have helped edit over there.
Yep.
So when Daniel had you on, I was like, I know that name. Where do I know that name? And I was like, oh yeah, I have all kinds of stuff by Bianca in my house. And I didn't even think about it. All right. So anyway, we'll end on that note. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.